At number 80 is Typhoon Opel, spelt a bit differently to the Opel that we're familiar with. This one formed in the Micronesian area and then moved into the Philippine Sea as a typhoon and then sped towards the northwest, became a Category 5 hurricane on approach to Taiwan, who are always getting hit by strong storms, and then made a Cat 5 landfall and another landfall as a typhoon in China as well. Both countries got spanked by this storm, but particularly Taiwan, who got hit by a 165-mile-an-hour landfall. Its peak, that was it. The peak intensity was 165 miles an hour, and its pressure was 900 millibars. You wouldn't want that heading towards you. 3 landfalls in the end. Strongest one, as I said, 165 miles an hour. Damaged $25 million at the time. 195 million in today's money. 21 people did lose their lives, and over 6,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. That was Opel at number 80. At number 79 is Super Typhoon Cimaron, which formed in October 2006, formed way out in the open western Pacific, became a tropical storm in the Philippine Sea, and then set course for Luzon, where it became a Category 5 just before landfall, as so many storms do, though this one was quite a bit worse than many of the others that have done so. It reached a secondary peak intensity of a Category 3 in the South China Sea, and looked as though it would move off towards the northeast at first, before moving back towards the south, weakening substantially in the South China Sea, and then just moved towards the southwest at a very slow pace indeed. Just about reached Vietnam before dissipating. Well, this storm, at its peak, of course it was a Category 5, it had a peak wind speed of 160 miles an hour, it had a minimum pressure of 920 millibars, which certainly isn't the most intense storm ever, but it did make a Category 5 landfall. That certainly counts for something. Damage was $31 million, $36 million in today's money. 34 people were killed by the storm, and 20,000 buildings were damaged, and that's quite remarkable as well. Here's a picture of the storm, an animation even, of how it progressed. There's the landfall, and that's what happened in the South China Sea. I think it was just stalling for time, wasn't it? Or maybe it was just stalling. Ah yes, Cyclone Pam, the most recent storm on our top 100. Update 1 on our new Cyclone Pam, which is located in the southern Pacific. It's already a Category 1 hurricane on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. It's Category 2 on the Australian scale and is expected to move towards the south and then eventually peak as a significant cyclone in between Vanuatu and Fiji as it heads towards the south. Of course, it ended up being much worse for one of those countries. Pam became not just a Category 4 beyond Vanuatu, but a Category 5 before Vanuatu, and that spelt disaster for some of those islands, particularly the ones further south, and the one which had its capital, Port Vila. Cyclone Pam was a very strong storm indeed, reaching a sub 900 millibar pressure, only the second storm I believe to do that in the South Pacific, just behind Zoe at 896 millibars, 165 mile an hour winds. It didn't make an official landfall even though it was very close to the Vanuatu Islands. It caused $250 million of damages and 16 fatalities.
It was definitely a storm that most storm trackers weren't exactly expecting to happen.
Yeah.
I myself wasn't exactly expecting a Category 5 to come out of Cyclone Pam.
If you can cast your mind back and in its formative stages, what did you guys think what were you guys expecting from the storm?
Well, I was only expecting a Category 3 to Cat 4. I wasn't expecting Cat 5, to be honest. But until I saw 165 miles an hour out of Pam, it left me speechless, really, because I wasn't exactly expecting that sort of power to come out of this Cyclone Pam. Yeah, this Cyclone Pam, basically the storm that made history in the South Pacific. Obviously, as we all know,
there were 16 fatalities. Obviously, Force 13 covered it extensively.
Well, to be honest, I wasn't exactly expecting Cyclone Pam to do the damage that it did, but until I saw the housing material, they had absolutely no chance. They weren't built to stand up against winds of 165 per hour.
So yeah, a very strong storm indeed. And just picking up on what Craig just said about how the construction isn't very good on many of these Pacific islands, and almost sitting ducks really, isn't it, waiting for the next big storm. They're much more rare down there, but they still happen. They still happen.
To be honest, another scenario like Pam, that's probably the last thing you'd really want to think of in the South Pacific, especially for Vanuatu.
In at number 77 is a storm known by the name the Tampico hurricane because of the place in Mexico where it made landfall. But it began in the eastern Caribbean, became a tropical storm, then a hurricane south of Jamaica, reached Category 5 very close to the Cayman Islands, and then eventually made landfall as a Cat 4 in the Yucatan Peninsula, a possible landfall on Cozumel there as well. It then moved into the Gulf of Mexico, Category 2 at landfall there, right on top of Tampico. The 14th storm of 1933. Cat 5, of course, 160 miles an hour. Its pressure was 929 millibars, same as one of the 2007 storms. Can't remember for the life of me which one anymore. 2 landfalls, the strongest one at 140 miles an hour. $5 million of damages back then. That's 91 million today. And 184 fatalities did result from the storm. 2,000 buildings were also damaged from number 77 in Hurricane Week 2015. At number 76, it's another super typhoon. This one goes by the name of Kit, which formed in June 1966 in the Philippine Sea, as all the Cat 5s tend to be doing, and then moved swiftly towards the north, becoming a Category 5 for well over a day, passing the Japanese outlying islands and then brushing the east coast close to Tokyo as a Category 1 typhoon. It's worse than it looked, by the way. It did cause a lot of damage, but onto that in a moment. Its peak intensity was 195 miles per hour apparently, though a lot of storms back then were reported very, very high. But despite the storm not making a landfall, 880 millibars by the way at its peak, it did come rather close to Japan, as you saw on the imagery on the animation not so long ago, and as a result it did cause heavy flooding in the Tokyo area and beyond, and lots of landslides too. 128,000 buildings were destroyed in the end, and the subway system was shut down because water was well over 3 feet deep. Now on to number 75, which is Super Typhoon Elsie, which formed in October 1989 and became a tropical storm in the Philippine Sea. And after moving rather sluggishly in the first few days, it then intensified to become, quite rapidly, a Category 4 storm and then a Cat 5 upon landfall in the Philippines, in Luzon yet again. And then it moved into the South China Sea and then on towards Vietnam, where it made its final landfall as a tropical storm. Elsie, of course, a Cat 5, we know that much already. It reached 160 miles an hour and reached a final pressure of 915 millibars in October 1989, and it caused a few problems in the Philippines as well. Of course, that Category 5 landfall, anyone would feel that. Its damage in total was $35 million at the time, 68 million adjusted for inflation, 47 fatalities, and 68,000 buildings were damaged by the storm. Here's some satellite imagery. At number 74 is a Western Pacific super typhoon that formed in September 2000 by the name of Saomai, which first began in the far open West Pacific and then trekked towards the Mariana Islands, becoming a Category 2 briefly, and then weakening, sort of doing a little bit of a loop down there as well, before passing just north of Saipan, before moving towards the northwest. And then it really started its intensification, not a silly Cat 2 peak, which is what it did earlier, and became a Category 5 on approach to the island of Daito in Japan. Didn't make it there as a Cat 5, it weakened substantially, and then moved very close to Okinawa as a Category 3, and then did a loop in the East China Sea, before moving into its most prominent landfall in South Korea. Saomai peaked as a 160 mile an hour Category 5 storm with an air pressure of 925 millibars in the end, and the main reason why it's in our top 100 is because of what it did in South Korea predominantly. Its landfall was at 80 miles an hour, but it did cause $295 million of damage at the time, equating to $405 million today. 28 people lost their lives and 7,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. What's more, nearly 500,000 people had to evacuate from this storm. And now we go back to 1973 and the strongest storm ever for 2 years. That was Typhoon Nora, which began life north of Palau and developed into a typhoon and developed into a Category 5, reaching a peak intensity of 877 millibars, and then hit the northern coast of the Philippines as a Category 3 before moving on to Taiwan and China as still a typhoon Category 1 until its final landfall in China, where it weakened again. So with an air pressure like that, needless to say it was very strong, with winds of 185 miles an hour, and that remarkable pressure, 877. Imagine being in that. 2 landfalls, the strongest one is a Cat 3, 115 miles an hour. $2 million in damages were reported, 11 million adjusted for inflation. 68 fatalities and 1,000 buildings were damaged as a result of this very, very powerful storm. Here's some images. At 72, we have Super Typhoon Dot, which formed in October 1985, and first started as a tropical depression, becoming a tropical storm just south of Guam, and then traversed into the Philippine Sea, where it really began to intensify, as many storms do there, becoming a Category 5 and maintaining that intensity for some time before bearing down on the Philippines and eventually making landfall in Luzon as a Category 3. It re-intensified in the South China Sea, grazing the southern coast of Hainan and making a final landfall in Vietnam. Dot, of course, reached Category 5 in the Philippine Sea, you just saw that, and its peak wind speed was 175 miles an hour, very strong, very deep as well, intense 895 millibar pressure. It made 2 landfalls, the strongest one being 125 miles an hour in the Philippines, $68 million of damages, 148 million that would be today, and 101 people lost their lives from this storm. 2,300 buildings were damaged as well. Here's some images of Dot, number 72, on Hurricane Week 2015. More recent history now, and it's Super Typhoon Nanmadol, which formed in August 2011, became a tropical storm to the northeast of the Philippines and intensified in not too much space, did it? Reaching Category 5 intensity just east of Luzon and then making an apparent landfall in the northern tip of Luzon as a Cat 4 before moving on to Taiwan, where it made another landfall there as a Category 1 and ultimately weakening substantially and dissipating just off the coast of China. Nanmadol, another strong Category 5, not that strong compared to others that we've seen, 160 miles an hour and a pressure of 925 millibars, certainly don't want to mess about with it though. 3 landfalls in the end, the strongest one, 140 miles an hour. It caused $603 million of damages, 635 adjusted for inflation, 38 fatalities, 1,458 buildings damaged, and 146,000 people had to evacuate from this storm. This is satellite imagery of Nanmadol. You can see how it moved towards the northwest and really got its act together in a rather short amount of time, certainly a short amount of space before that eye popped out, and then it really made a run for the Philippines. Number 71 in Hurricane Week 2015. And now we move on to 1964 and a very interesting storm, Typhoon Louise. Already a Category 3 as it passed the south of Palau, became a Category 5 and struck the Philippines at that intensity before rapidly weakening over land. It was a short-lived storm, but it did pack a punch. That's why it's number 70 on our Hurricane Week. Its 190 mile an hour peak wind speed is one of the highest around, 915 millibars the pressure. 3 landfalls, the strongest one at Cat 5 in the Philippines, in Mindanao. Damages unknown, though there were 400 fatalities. Little is known about the storm, but because of its significant fatality amount, it is number 70 this year. At number 69 is our first Indian Ocean storm, Cyclone Pam, which became a Category 5 in October 2013. I'm sure many of you remember it well, making landfall as a high-end Cat 4 in India on the east coast there. It peaked with winds of 160 miles an hour. Its pressure was around 918 millibars. Its actual figure is not actually known. It made a landfall as a strong Category 4 with winds of 155 miles an hour, causing $696 million in damages. Adjusted for inflation today, that's 707. 45 fatalities in the end. 2,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed, and it caused well over 1 million evacuations. And here's some of the fantastic images from that storm near its peak. Look at these. And here's some of the damage pictures as well near the landfall zone. As you can see, some significant devastation. This, I believe, was an image just before the storm hit, and this was after. Number 69 on Hurricane Week 2015, Cyclone Pam of 2013. Next up is Super Typhoon Cimaron in 2007 in the West Pacific. A storm that formed in August in the Philippine Sea. Looked like it would be a real storm for the Philippines at first, becoming a Category 5 east of there, but eventually it turned towards the northwest, and although the northern part of the Philippines, the islands offshore, had some bad weather, it did finally make its landfall as a major typhoon in Taiwan and then moved on to China. That's where most of the problems occurred from this storm. It peaked with winds of 160 miles an hour. Its pressure was 910 millibars, estimated by the JMA. It made 2 landfalls in the end, Taiwan and China. Its strongest one was the first, of course, 120 miles an hour, causing $693 million of damages at the time. Very similar to the damage caused by Pam, actually, and similar fatality count as well, 43, though only 70 buildings are known to have been damaged or destroyed from this storm. And here it is, another beautiful Category 5, and here's some radar imagery as well as it passed through near the Japanese islands, though it didn't affect Japan necessarily, it hit Taiwan instead. Yes, we're back in the West Pacific again, and this time it's Super Typhoon Nora, which formed ironically on the same day Katrina was dissipating, passed just north of Saipan as a significant typhoon, and then became a Category 5 in that area that many storms do, as we saw this year in 2015 in particular. It then moved off towards the northwest, almost a direct hit. In fact, it was over the Daito Islands of Japan, and then became a Cat 4 again on approach to Japan, really worrying people there. And impressive imagery as well on that, which you'll see shortly. But its initial peak was at Cat 5 with winds of 160 miles an hour, pressure of 925. Don't forget, it made a typhoon landfall on the Japanese mainland islands, or the main 4 islands, Kyushu in particular this time. Made a landfall with winds of 120 miles an hour on one of the islands and caused nearly $1 billion of damage at the time, 1.18 billion adjusted for inflation. 35 fatalities in all, 28,000 buildings damaged or destroyed. And here's some images as the storm was progressing northwards. That was during its second peak as a Category 4, and then gradual weakening as it moved over Kyushu and some of its associated islands to the south, the Ryukyu Islands. Here's the imagery of its whole progression a massive eye on that second peak and then passing as an extratropical cyclone to the northeast. And here's a slowed down version showing the radar imagery as that storm made its second peak just as it passed the Amami Islands and then moved northwards towards Kyushu, eventually making that landfall either as a Cat 1 or Cat 2 and then moving off towards the northeast there. Number 67 on Hurricane Week 2015.
A storm that happened in 2007 in the Atlantic, Category 5, the last one that we've ever had as it goes along in the record books at the moment. 8 years since it happened now. Hurricane Felix, which made, I think it was a Category 5 landfall, wasn't it? Was that the one that was further south?
Hurricane Felix, I think.
I get confused between the two, Dean and Felix. Very similar tracking storms. One of them made landfall in Yucatan and one of them made landfall in Nicaragua. I think Felix was the one further south.
Most people remember the storm, but Central Americans will remember the damage. $720 million in damages at the time, and 133 people lost their lives in the storm. 10,000 buildings were also damaged as well in the area that regularly gets hit by severe storms.
Felix really intensified very quickly, and I think it was unexpected of that quick intensity can occur.
Peaked with winds of 175 miles an hour and a pressure of 929 millibars. Cat 5 landfall with winds of 160. Not at its peak, but still, you wouldn't want to get in the way of that.
Well, I'd probably like to add in how quick Hurricane Felix intensified. I mean, it was a very quick, rapid intensification that Felix went under in the Caribbean Sea. I mean, it's a very impressive hurricane to see on the satellite imagery. It was...
Yeah.
Yeah.
At number 65 is Super Typhoon Bilis that formed in the Philippine Sea in August 2000 and gradually intensified rather quickly in the end to become a Category 5 storm by August 23rd, an intensity that it maintained all the way up until landfall in Taiwan and then moved on to China still as a typhoon. Its peak wind speed was only the 160 miles an hour. I say only, but it's still a Category 5 and is still going to wipe out anything in its way. 920 millibars was the lowest pressure. 2 landfalls, the strongest one was a Cat 5. There were $668 million of damages from this storm, 918 million if you account for today's inflation. 71 fatalities and 650 buildings were damaged or destroyed. Here's the storm, look at that. For number 64, we go back to July 2005, and whilst the Atlantic was hotting up, the West Pacific had a trick up its sleeve as well, and this was Haitang, a long tracking storm that formed well east, dropped to the south a little bit, and then became a Category 5 storm on approach to Taiwan, on a long approach I have to say, and eventually did hit Taiwan as a Category 3, slowed down over land, which was proved to be critical, and then moved over China as a tropical storm. This storm peaked as a Category 5, as we just saw. Strong storms, all of the ones on the top 100, 920 millibars again, just like the last one you saw actually. That is an estimated air pressure. 2 landfalls, almost a mirror image of the one we just saw at number 65. 115 miles an hour was the strongest landfall, significantly weaker, but it did cause $1.1 billion of damages and 13 fatalities with 24,000 buildings destroyed, which is why it ranks just a 1 higher than Bilis.
And let's move on now to Hurricane Emily of 2005. Initially, operationally, wasn't a Category 5, but they upped it at the last minute in the post-season analysis to a 160 mile an hour Cat 5, also a pressure of 929 millibars. Made 4 landfalls in the end, the strongest one being a 130 mile an hour Cat 4 landfall. And I think that was on the Yucatan Peninsula, wasn't it? But I think Caesar, this one's a rather interesting storm in your neck of the woods as well.
Yes, actually, Emily. Well, it was a very it's a very big disaster from Yucatan Peninsula.
And after it moved on from the Yucatan, it made its last landfall not far from you, didn't it?
Yes, made landfall in La Pesca, Tamaulipas, I think, and passed very, very near to my place in Monterrey. Right. But I don't remember also tropical storm conditions in that date. Okay. So.
Well, elsewhere, it was a pretty bad storm, except for over Caesar's house. There are 17 fatalities in total from the storm, and it did cause $1 billion of damages at the time. That'd be 1.2 in today's money. And it did destroy, damage 10,000 buildings and destroyed 116. 10,000 people evacuated from that storm as well. Emily, a very strong storm, not the strongest of 2005, but it doesn't have to be a serious disaster.
At number 62 is Super Typhoon Chaba in August 2004. Quite the storm as well, but it had humble beginnings, as they all do, in the far eastern part of the western Pacific, and then it became a very strong storm as it passed through the Mariana Islands, exiting those islands as a Category 5, intensity that it maintained for around 4 days, the longest in modern times really, since the 60s or so. Right, remarkable effort, and it reached a secondary peak as a Category 4 just to the northeast of the Diata Islands of Japan as well, and stayed strong all the way into Kyushu, where it made landfall as a Category 2 and was still apparently tropical by the time it reached Hokkaido, just about. The peak wind speed from Typhoon Chaba was rather high, 180 miles an hour, and its pressure was around 910 millibars estimated. 2 landfalls in the end. The strongest one was at 90 miles an hour, just shy of Cat 2 then in the end, with damage reports of $977 million. Adjusted for inflation, that pushes it just above the 1 billion mark today. 20 fatalities and over 56,000 buildings damaged or destroyed. When it comes down to it, that's the sort of figure that really puts the human perspective into things if you've not got a home to live in after it's been destroyed or flooded or submerged by something like this. Chaba, number 62. $1962, November, the season pretty much over, or is it? No, because Karen had something to say about that and became a remarkably strong Category 5, went right over Guam at that intensity and caused devastation on the island. Maintained Category 5 intensity for several days and then moved towards the north, passing some of those Japanese islands and then moving off towards the northeast. So it spared Japan, really, in the end. It was Guam who really got hit by this storm. We'll look at the damage on that in a short moment. Its peak intensity was a very strong 185 miles an hour, and I don't doubt that with how long it remained a Cat 5 for. 900 millibars the reported pressure. One landfall, 175 miles per hour at landfall. $250 million at the time. That translates to 1.94 billion today in 2015. 37 fatalities and 7,000 buildings were damaged, most of those on Guam. Here's some radar images of the storm. You can clearly see that eye wall there. And here are some of the damage pictures, and they are quite extensive. Most of the buildings had roofs taken off. You can see on some of these images that many buildings are no longer there anymore, completely destroyed, flattened, basically. Many trees defoliated, all sorts of chaos. Loose objects, who knows where they'll be now, but many of those buildings severely damaged, some walls falling, some roofs falling through, so it's little wonder why this storm was a rather deadly one and a pretty bad one for Guam, where it was reported that 95% of all buildings were damaged or destroyed. Terrible storm in 1962. It's Karen, number 61 on Hurricane Week 2015.